For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. On the talking point today, we go to Berlin, where we have Andrew Small, who's the author of a new book called The Rupture, China and the Global Race for the Future. A warm welcome to all our viewers who are joining this live stream, and a welcome to those viewers who will pick this up later on our YouTube channel. Like we said, we're going live to Berlin, where we're joined by Andrew Small. He's a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund. But more importantly, and to the point, why we're talking to him today is because he has a new book out, which is called The Rupture, China and the Global Race for the Future. Andrew, there are two titles, I think. One is for the American market. The Rupture is probably for the Commonwealth, and No Limits is for the American market, right?
Exactly so. Thanks for having me on. That's right. It's the same book, two titles: No Limits. Yes, as the image has it, the inside story of China's war with the West, and The Rupture, China and the Global Race for the Future, which is the edition that will be available in India and other Commonwealth locations.
Extremely readable book, I must say. I found it very interesting, especially I was also watching one of your book talks in the US on the East Coast, where I think the moderator or the person who was handling that discussion was talking about how you're making think tanks extremely sexy in terms of where you go and who you speak to. And, I mean, apart from, of course, all the major capitals, Washington, Berlin, it's Pakistan, Gwadar, New Delhi, Latvia. So, and I really like the chapters which are named after iconic songs. I believe there's a Spotify channel after that as well.
There is indeed. A colleague and friend, Jonas Perello-Plesner, put together a Spotify playlist based on the song titles for the book and the chapters. So it is also available already, yes.
Yeah, super. Andrew, just looking at India, which is the only country so far to have to face Chinese aggression, which turned to, of course, deadly military clashes. Blood and life was given. Former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to China, Vijay Gokhale, describes the state of the situation since May 2020 as moving from peaceful coexistence to armed coexistence. In your book, you touch upon it as India's need now to align even more closely with the emerging counter-China coalition. Just looking at current events, there's a current Yuddha Abhyas, as it's called, army exercises with the US near the line of control. There's the Malabar naval exercises, which are held late last month off the coast of Japan with Quad countries. That's a military dimension of that need that you're talking about, clearly rankling the Chinese Communist Party. But how important, with your sources in the West, is India as a cog in the wheel in this coalition?
Well, I mean, you talk about it, of course, in the military dimension first, which is critical, and certainly the dimension of rivalry that India is experiencing with China in that sense is qualitatively different from almost any other country that we're talking about in this regard. So, of course, being able to do closer intelligence sharing, have other strategic partners on all of these things matters greatly. But the book also looks at this in the context of the economic and technological dimensions of the longer term rivalry with China. And in this regard, I think India is also increasingly understood to be a central part of what those coalitions look like too. And not just on the part of the United States, but I think in Europe as well. I think that the question on what the future kind of balance of power is in the overall global economic landscape, in the future of technology, India is understood, I think, to a much greater extent than before, to be just a critical hinge country in this respect. And I mean, the Biden administration has, of course, been trying to intensify the building of coalitions across economics and technology. I mean, the Quad, in a sense, these have been some of the elements that have been deepened in the working groups in the last period of time. But if you looked at the visit of Ursula von der Leyen earlier this year, you look at the efforts on the EU-India free trade agreement, and you look really from the company's perspective at the need to rebalance and diversify away from China in a context of all of these kinds of heightened risks. India becomes more and more of a focal point in that regard. And I think there's a lot that's locked in already and that's developed in certain dimensions on the intelligence and military side. But what's going on in terms of the structures of cooperation, trade and technology agreements, all of these issues, I mean, there's a reason that the first Trade and Technology Council that was set up by the EU, not with the United States, beyond the United States, was with India. And I think that's the other piece of the landscape that is really important on this. I mean, when you look at the response to what played out on the border last time, it wasn't just a military question. What went on with the app ban, the controls on Chinese technology finance, all of these sorts of things. These were interesting lateral moves because from China's perspective, I mean, India was the most important developing world market, but really any international market when it came to consumer-facing technologies, for instance. And so there's been a real cost to them in terms of their future control of the global landscape to lose, in certain ways, India as a result of the actions that they took. So I think this dimension of it as well is extremely important beyond, I think, the more obvious and more commonly discussed parts of what's going on the military and security side.
Sure. Part of that military and technology side, I think one of your US contacts mentioned that finally the 4 foundational agreements had been signed with India, and that changed. But just looking at publicly what happened after the Biden-Xi meeting at the G20 in Bali, it is, of course, to reduce tension, to prevent conflict, or to build a floor. But in India, there are those who warn that national interests, or the deep intertwining of economic interests with China. We've seen Chancellor Scholz go to Beijing. The Chinese investment in the Hamburg port terminal was cleared. There is a feeling among some that, say, like Chancellor Scholz or the US, you sup with our enemy, that's India's enemy, in your national interest, but you ask us not to deal with your enemy, which is Russia, which is in India's national interest. So, the feeling is, what if the Americans move from a tango to a thaw with China at some point of time?
So, I mean, I think there's quite different answers at the moment to this on the US side and the European side. And I think there's some different context, really, even on what's going on between Europe and China and certainly India and Russia. So I think on the US-China side, the chances of this moving into a thaw are virtually non-existent. What we saw with that summit was, yes, they wanted to put a floor under the relationship. Yes, there was a view that the situation had been escalating, particularly in the developments around Taiwan, in problematic ways, and both sides wanted to ensure that the competitive and rivalrous dimensions of the relationship didn't spill over into outright conflict. I think they also wanted to just demonstrate that it's possible to transact on some of the global issues that were at stake in the G20. I think there was a concern among partners as well, others in the region, and beyond that, about how the relationship was being handled. But this was a pretty unusual summit. This is not what a US-China summit used to look like. A US-China summit used to look like something where there was an important and consequential bilateral agenda, big things that the US was after. You look at the Trump administration's push on the trade deal, for instance. This had none of that. This was a containing the fallout, minimizing risks kind of summit, something that, has of course been characterized by some as the first summit of the new Cold War or something along these lines. But this was not something that was creating the preconditions for a real warming of relations. And I think it was understood that way on both sides. The European piece of this is a little bit more complex at the moment. I mean, as I trace out in the book, the European position has moved very, very dramatically on China in recent years. When the concept of China being a systemic rival was first talked about, back in 2019, this wasn't something that was kind of commonly said by European politicians. Now, even when the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, goes to China, he still writes an op-ed before his trip saying that China is a systemic rival and these sorts of things that Angela Merkel would never have said. I think there is a new sort of common sense that's developed really on China in this regard. There's a very different set of tools that the Europeans are putting in place to deal with China. This is a much colder relationship, but there are differences in views on how far the economies should be disentangled. The Chancellor here in Berlin certainly still thinks that there's a lot of economic business to be done still, even at the time when many others, even in his own coalition and certainly in much of the rest of Europe, think that this is a repeat of the risky dependencies that were being built with Russia, and that there needs to be more significant moves in the other direction right now to diversify, to move away from at least deepening the risks. But I think the fact is, for now, everyone is doing economic business with China. There are dependencies. India is doing economic business with China. The United States is doing economic business with China, and Europe is doing economic business with China. So this is still going to be a factor in all of our trade relationships for some time to come. Even the most optimistic versions of how we unwind some of the most difficult dependencies on the Chinese market, this is going to take a number of years. This isn't going to happen quickly. So we're all in the same boat in the sense that there are continue to be close commercial relations and real dependencies in certain specific sectors on this. But I do think there are some distinctions when it comes to the Europe-China relationship, say, and the Russia-India relationship. I know they're sometimes analogized in this regard, but I mean, Europe is sanctioning China. Europe is describing China outright as a rival. There are moves, I think, that have been underway on that regard. I think the language that European leaders now use to describe China is still not something I would expect to hear an Indian leader use of Russia as things stand. It's a very, very different relationship when it comes to, of course, the importance of Russian arms supplies for the Indian military and these things. Europe doesn't have that relationship with Russia. There's a commercial basis, but it's a commercial basis that is I would still say shared with others too. And I think there are points where I certainly think there are real questions about where the overall balance of European policy in this regard, but Europe is sometimes made more unusual in this way than it really is, when lots of others actually have these significant trade ties as well.
So just a reminder to our viewers to like this video and share the link with your colleagues or anyone who will be interested in this subject. Andrew, to illustrate how what you were just talking about in terms of dynamics having changed, you write in your book about the time that you were invited to a lunch at the Benjamin Franklin dining room hosted by then Vice President Biden and Secretary of State Kerry for Xi Jinping. I think it was in 2015. And you talk about, you're talking about economic linkages. You said the CEO nearest to you in the queue outside the State Department that day, Tim Cook, had seen his company make almost $60 billion in China that year, 25% of Apple's global revenue. The luster, as you put it, of the Chinese market working its magic. You even talk about Mark Zuckerberg offering Xi Jinping the opportunity to name his child.
Yeah, and I think that there's two changes to this. One is what's going on in projections for the Chinese market, and one is what's going on when it comes to an understanding of the reliability of China for production facilities. And you only need to look at Apple and what's gone on with their iPhone factory in Zhengzhou and the Foxconn production facilities there, and what's played out with zero COVID to see what that amounts to. As a production hub, China in the last 2 or 3 years has demonstrated itself as a result of the extremely politicized decision-making that we have seen on zero COVID, the Russia relationship, and I think what some of the fears are from companies in this regard as well, that they will see a repeat of this, the experience that they went through in Russia, in China too. There's been what in the past was the kind of China plus one strategy for firms, it has moved further and faster than it was in any of the preceding years. Business confidence among US and European firms has really plummeted in the last period of time. And this is building on a trend of politicized decision-making, more ideological, more securitized decision-making under Xi Jinping, that has simply said, the kind of traditional pragmatic framework that used to exist, and a framework that said that the most important thing for China was GDP growth at 8%, that the party still depended on economic growth to sustain its popularity, all of these sorts of things. There's been a significant shift under Xi Jinping, and firms are looking at that differently and are having to move production facilities out of a kind of single source reliance on China to other locations. That's underway. And of course, the projections on the Chinese economy in the coming years, some of them for long-term structural reasons, some of them as a result of the decision-making that we've seen under Xi Jinping, means this is not the endlessly growing high-growth market that we had in the preceding decades. Growth projections for China are substantially lower now. And so when there are these firms that were looking out on kind of straight lines heading up, for years and years, they're now looking at a context in which that's not the case for the overall market, and a context in which the kind of move towards self-reliance, the squeeze that a lot of foreign firms have seen, has intensified. And so it means the real scale of the accessible market for some of these firms is actually looking much smaller. So certainly, I think the shift in business confidence on China, and we've seen that in financial flows, we've seen that in future investment decisions, we see that in simply the numbers that the Chambers of Commerce come out with, has moved very, very markedly just in the last year.
Sure. I just you've partly answered this question, so I'm just trying to find from one of our viewers. Just give me a sec. Yeah. Dinesh Kumar, who says, how difficult is it going to be for America to convince Wall Street to decouple from China, as we're seeing, despite US concerns on TikTok data, Apple and Google are reluctant to act upon it?
I mean, I think the challenge, there's a real process that's been underway actually for a number of years now with a lot of US firms on China. That this is not a and the trade-offs on some of these choices are important. If you look at, for instance, the measures that we saw on US export controls on semiconductors that came out in October, a really significant set of moves to restrict China's access to, and not just the advanced node semiconductors themselves, but design tools, US personnel, all of these sorts of things as well. And the sense was still that for a number of these firms, being able to sell a certain range of their products, the more mature semiconductors, is still helpful to their innovation capacity. If they're still able to benefit from the Chinese market for selling the less sensitive semiconductors, then this is going to be part of these firms maintaining their innovation edge. It can't necessarily be expected that the US government will plow all of the money into these firms for research and development purposes, and nor would the firms want that. So it's still in some of these sectors seem to be advantageous that you maintain some level of access to the Chinese market, even when it comes to some of these areas of maintaining US technology edge, maintaining the US military technological edge. And that was a real debate, of course, that was underway in the Department of Defense on what those trade-offs look like as well. And I think what we're not going to get is a version of decoupling, and there is certainly decoupling taking place, that is a kind of wholesale unraveling of the two economies. You're going to see judgment calls made sector by sector on what the risks amount to, what the trade-offs are. This, I think, at certain points in the Trump administration was done without a huge amount of economic modeling, without a huge amount of consultation with the firms themselves. I think, and certainly without a huge amount of consultation with partners and allies on this. I think the last couple of years have been more deliberative, more consultative. But again, if you actually then look at the costs to some of these firms, look at the share prices of the semiconductor firms, there's been a hit from the decisions that the US took. If you look at the finance if you look at how US finance has moved in the last year, a lot of funding has been flowing out of China in the first months of this year and a whole series of junctures since. So I think these things are playing out. They're playing out not necessarily quickly, and I think that's by design. I think some of these things are moved, and even at the end point on this, you're still going to have significant levels of commercial relations between these countries. This is going to be a kind of unraveling in certain specific sectors, and a trend that heads in a particular direction on this, but not one that ends up with the kind of straw man of the wholly decoupled trade relationship. This is not going to exist. There are going to be certain forms of commercial ties. The question is, what are the sectors that I think are understood by both sides as safe, mutually beneficial areas of trade, and the judgment calls on that have moved. And they've moved on the Chinese side as well. I mean, China is also significantly trying to reduce its international dependencies, is trying to become more self-reliant, is in a sense becoming somewhat more autarkic in its approach in various areas. So and of course, originally this, going back to the question about Mark Zuckerberg, this was evidently driven on the Chinese side in the first place. I mean, if you're looking at the big US tech firms, most of them never had access to the Chinese market because there was a decoupled internet that China had built. So this is an approach that China has been taking for a long time in a whole series of areas. What you had was this asymmetry of openness in which China locked out access to certain sectors while having pretty free access to much of the rest of the world. And I think what's really been going on in the last period of time has been a rebalancing from the rest of the world, and certainly from the advanced economies, to say that this asymmetry can't last.
Sure. Moving from one lunch to the other, from 2015 to one that was hosted just yesterday by the sitting Vice President Kamala Harris and the Secretary of State Blinken, Biden has laid out the red carpet for Macron. Macron will be going to Beijing apparently in January. There's talk of some kind of mediation, but then that's a separate topic because Biden has proposed talks and Russia has responded, etc. But in terms of these coalitions that you're talking about in advanced Western countries, was France ahead of the others in its China policy, and is the bitterness over AUKUS behind the allies?
I mean, the interesting thing is when the Trump administration sent their first international delegation to Europe, this big interagency kind of delegation to Europe on China, the first place they sent it to was Paris. It wasn't London. I think the understanding was that the French role in the Indo-Pacific, in particular on security terms, was something that was an approach that was actually extremely consistent with how the US saw strategic developments in the region. There was significant scope for complementarity and cooperation. And actually, if you look at a whole series of other areas of the balance of the European approach, going back to the previous question, what is the relative balance of openness of our systems? What's the relative balance when it comes to industrial policy, when it comes to thinking about trade policy through a kind of purely market lens, or a lens that looks at some of the more political and security dimensions to this? The French approach, I think, had already moved ahead of other parts of Europe. France has driven the Indo-Pacific strategy of not just the EU as a whole, which it certainly did, and was out ahead itself on that, but was a catalyst for other European countries moving in terms of developing their own Indo-Pacific strategies. So you certainly have, at the same time, a view on the French side that says Europe should be strategically autonomous, and sometimes that means strategically autonomous as specifically differentiated from the United States in ways that I think are often can be frustrating and unhelpful for the countries that actually think that transatlantic alliance building in some of these areas is critical, including on some of the strategic economic issues right now. So I think painting the French position either way on this, either as which some do, as the kind of the main differentiator from the US in Europe, trying to build a purely distinct role, or seeing which I suppose is less frequently suggested, but actually, in some respects, the most important strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific among European states. And I would say until the UK swung in subsequently, I would say if I straw poll defense officials in Washington, they would have said that France was the more important strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific. I think the UK has been on catch up somewhat in that respect, and there's still a qualitatively different form of French military presence there.
Sure. You write about COVID and China's behavior during COVID being one of the shocks that shaped Western policy. You talk about some of your sources, and you were initially circumspect on getting messages of a possible Chinese Communist Party sinister, malign intent. Those are the words you use. Explain that, and also, the current zero COVID policy facing protests that have been described as never seen since Tiananmen.
So, the book opens with a message from a friend of mine who has since published a very interesting book of his own. Desmond Shum published a fantastic book, Red Roulette, about his time in close dealings with the upper levels of the Communist Party, and his own time as a business person in China. Desmond is someone I knew going a long way back. We were friends back in China in the early 2000s, and is someone I always found to be a very sharp analyst and extremely thoughtful on how the Communist Party worked. At the beginning before the COVID pandemic had broken out beyond China's borders, he had sent me this rather alarming message when he had been going through analyzing the kind of economic impact of COVID initially. And then he was troubled by some of the decisions that he saw on the Chinese government's part. And he sent me this message saying that his analysis was that China had decided that if China was going down with this, the rest of the world was too, and that the decisions were going to lead to COVID spreading more widely beyond China's borders. And certainly my response at the time was, this is a bit much. I'm skeptical about this analysis, and as I note in the book, it still had a slightly conspiracy theory like quality to it. But it was another one of the many instances in the last few years where you kind of catch yourself as a China analyst saying, have I gone far enough in really adjusting to the realities of how things have moved and what the decision making looks like under Xi Jinping, and where the party really is on some of these questions. I still don't know and necessarily have no grounds for believing exactly that this was necessarily the case. I'm still not necessarily willing to believe that this was done by malign intent. But there are so many of these cases where you have to catch yourself and think sometimes into darker places as to where some of the decision making in these areas is really going. Right now, of course, we're seeing this panicked rebalancing of COVID policy in China after a period now of nearly 3 years of extreme an approach to COVID lockdowns and zero COVID, and essentially a level of societal control that has seemed that it has felt advantageous to the party to do this. It seemed that whatever the practical benefits of it, and there still are, as long as the vaccination program among the Chinese elderly is as inadequate as it is. But the reason it's inadequate, if you're thinking of coercive steps or that the Chinese government could have taken, they could have taken the steps to ensure that the vaccination rates were much higher. And of course, the reason that the vaccine efficacy is low is because the Chinese government has refused to use foreign mRNA vaccines And so you've had what looked like a set of decisions that have either been inept, paranoid, and magnified the degree to which the COVID lockdowns have to take place, or to some extent, and you've had an approach that has said, we like the control elements of this, this is useful. And what we saw in the last period of time was people snapping on this. And it's not just zero COVID as a policy in general. It's the way in which these lockdowns have been put into effect, the capricious decision making at local levels, the kind of extremity of the entire thing, and that at least is something that we're now seeing some relaxing on. I mean, the sort of harsher edges of it are now, it would appear, coming off a little bit as a result of the protests that we saw in recent days, and really quite unprecedented protests. I mean, this is indeed, as the analogies have made, you haven't seen protests on this scale and in so many diverse locations and targeted as directly at the central leadership since Tiananmen. The Chinese government now has fantastically sophisticated repressive capacities that they didn't have then, to be able to deal with this in quite different ways. But it has also been clear that they need to make at least some moves on the way that zero COVID was being enforced. Otherwise, they would continue to inflame precisely these dynamics. And so we are seeing at least some effort to start readjusting this, and to deal with the areas in which you had these significant deficiencies, particularly with reference to the vaccination rates. You still don't yet see openness to foreign mRNA vaccines, for instance.
Sure. Just a reminder to our viewers, you see that scroll at the bottom of your screen. If you want to get latest updates on what we put up on our website or videos like this one, just join our Telegram circle. You can also help support us. There's a UPI QR code link in the YouTube descriptor. Just a couple of quick responses to viewer questions, and then if I can go back to the book, Andrew. Matara says, given that China owns so much of US debt, is it possible that China can make things difficult for the US on the economic front?
I think there used to be a lot more concern about that. I think there was this kind of line that, China is the US banker and these sorts of things. I think the sense has been that, firstly, I mean, of course there could be, if China wanted to dump US treasuries, there would be a significant impact. But I mean, this remains an extremely fungible market for the US. And I think the sense is still that this is not, that this perception of dependence in that regard has changed quite notably. I mean, of course, China is doing this because they have to. I mean, this is the economic model that they have in place. This is a set of structures that they are, in a sense, condemned to. This is not something that they've been doing to build up leverage. This is a necessary byproduct of their economic policy. And we've, of course, had these big junctures in which, around the financial crisis, most obviously, if China had taken certain decisions at that juncture, they could have induced a deeper set of financial problems for the United States at that moment. I mentioned that the Hank Paulson discussions in Beijing in this regard. But to me, it's been one of the striking things in recent years, how far that has moved away from the concerns of US policy makers as to what would actually happen in practice if the US would try, if China were to try to weaponize this. I think the sense has rather shifted towards a view that says that this would be swallowed in other ways in the market. It will certainly be damaging to China as well, but I think it's the analysis on what this represents, I think has certainly moved away from the concerns that there used to be there, particularly a decade ago.
Mehul Lad asks, Andrew, with the partial decoupling in process, you were talking about, like an onion being peeled. Is the West looking towards India, or are they more inclined to focus on domestic industry?
It's very much both. I think there is, there's a few parts to this. I mean, firstly, yes, there is an element of reshoring that part is unquestionably taking place. There is a view that says that certain domestic capabilities need to be there. You're seeing that in the US, you're seeing that in Europe. So there is an element that there is a part of it that is reshoring, but you can't do all of this through domestic industry alone. So there is the nearshoring piece of this, of course, but then if you look at the kind of capacity constraints in some of the immediate locations around, say, European periphery or the US periphery, there's limits to what you can do in that regard as well. So the friendshoring piece is then the diversification generally, but the friendshoring piece becomes extremely important, and Asia in general has been important. Vietnam was always an important location, other parts of Southeast Asia. But I think the sense is that if you're able to make certain forms of progress with India in the coming years, that's probably the single location that can make the most difference. I think this is why there is this really renewed energy on the European side when it comes to the FTA question, and other ways around just the old model FTA negotiations, because there were some limitations to what it was possible to do with that. They're still very important, but I think there is an even deeper level of engagement on the trade and technology front that goes beyond what the kind of traditional form negotiations looked like. The TTC that I mentioned that had been put together somewhat exemplifies that. But I mean, you're seeing this from companies. I mean, in one sense, the form of globalization that was Sino-centric was the easy version. There was a period of time in which it was cheap, straightforward, to put a whole series of these facilities in China. In one way, the single sort of most effective way of doing that in one place that has the capacity and could really absorb a lot of this would be to be able to fix some of these agreements and agree a different set of conditions with India. And that would rely on a few things happening simultaneously. I mean, for production facilities to be located in India, then having access to certain markets, some of these FTAs that are being negotiated is particularly important. This is not, China production was never just about the Chinese market. A lot of it is still about the Chinese market, but the Indian market is important, but this was also producing in China for the rest of the world. And I think that's certainly what you're seeing. I mean, Apple is a good example of this, but you're seeing this from other firms as well. They want to be able to do this. Some of the obstacles, the known obstacles are still there, but there is a different level of political push at the moment to overcome that. And so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on India in the coming period of time as a byproduct of this impetus away from the kind of China-centered globalization. And I think there is a real battle of narratives that is there on this right now, because the criticism is that this is all deglobalization, and that this is a kind of the West putting up the drawbridge and pulling up the ladder. And I think there are some who want to do that. And there is going to be a dimension of this kind of reshoring piece and thinking about domestic industry differently. But I think there is also going to be a more global version of globalization that goes on simultaneously. It will be more work. It will be harder to do in various parts of the developing world where, and not just India, where trade agreements, where infrastructure, where a whole series of things aren't quite where they need to be. But I think that there's going to be a lot more impetus on that in the coming stretch. And I mean, China rebalanced for a lot of countries what form of kind of the economic balance in the country looked like. You had a lot of commodity exporters who'd been looking to build up their manufacturing capacities, who then got sort of pushed back into being suppliers for China on low value exports and things. There is an opportunity as the rebalancing away from this kind of China-centric version of things takes place for some of these economies to do what they had wanted to do even back in the early to mid 2000s. But certainly in India is in the discussions that I have in Europe and the US on this. This is this would, in a sense, be the big prize, to be able to really transform the nature of the trade and economic relations. But I think people understand that the difficulties that existed before in the deals that need to be done on this have not gone away.
Talking about difficulties, Andrew, back in your book, again, you talk about competing coalitions, China, Pakistan. Your old friend from your Islamabad days, Zhao Lijian, is now talking about accelerating energy development under CPEC. You delineate how CPEC has proved not to be the China model to follow.
Yeah, I mean, there's a section of the book that really looks at, I mean, I think whatever the differences that exist between a number of the key countries involved, there is a nascent coalition of countries that is looking at China in a certain way. If you step back, if you go back a few years and you look at what to me were real differences in analysis on this, there is a significant level of convergence on this between Europe, various states in Asia, and the United States, in terms of the fact that we're dealing with a systemic competitor, rival, challenge, however you want to frame it. And there are different nuances, different equities that different countries have. But I do think the level of coordination, cooperation, and shared analysis that exists on this is remarkably different from what we were seeing several years earlier. So I do think, and China understands this, China sees the coalition building that's taking place. They've seen it accelerating under the current US administration. And in parallel, their view has been, and this predates that they need to build a coalition of their own. There's been significant rethinking of how they approach alignment, non-alignment, alliances, these sorts of questions. Of course, technically, they only have a treaty alliance with North Korea, but Pakistan has had, I mean, when I was doing a lot of the work on my previous book and around the time the book was launching, was very striking seeing this shift in the Chinese discourse, because the relationship went back a long way, but the understanding that you saw on the Chinese side was actually, what is a model for a security relationship that is extremely close, extremely trusted, but that doesn't embroil China in formal alliance commitments? What's a kind of model that will mean that if you want use future military facilities, if you want to cooperate around the region on intelligence and military matters, who are you able to work with in this? Where does that political trust exist? And so you kept coming to Pakistan, and it was actually a country that Chinese strategists frankly didn't think about very much. The South Asia people did, and certain people in the PLA did, and certain people in the intelligence services did. But really, for the people who were, US strategy-focused people in the Chinese system, Pakistan didn't come up very much. And then it started to, in this context, which was, how do you model a relationship that they want to replicate in other cases? They want to replicate in cases where you say, we need to deepen military and intelligence ties, we need to build political trust, and we need a framework that can last for decades on this. China's moving ahead with global military basing in a way that is qualitatively different from what we had seen before. And it's willing to take steps with some of its security partners that it was not before. That's what we saw in the China-Russia no limits agreement back in February. There were things that China agreed to in that joint statement. There are things that the two sides have agreed to on the development of military technologies and on various other fronts that had not been possible in the past. But of course, the selling point that China has for a lot of countries is not just its military power and kind of overall strategic power position in the world. It's the economic piece. It's its capacity to provide financing, investment, resources. And CPEC, in that sense, had been intended not just as a sort of not just to serve certain purposes in the bilateral relationship with Pakistan. It was understood to be a model. This is why it was called the flagship for the Belt and Road. China wanted countries to look at what was going on with CPEC and say, well, these are the benefits that accrue to a close friend. This is what we can have too. And of course, there are all sorts of actors in the Chinese system. It doesn't mean that everyone was negotiating the contracts actually thought like that. It doesn't mean, there was a complex set of motivations that were at stake for China. That wasn't the only one. But this was certainly in the conversations that I was having with all sorts of people on the Chinese side at the time, how it was understood too. And in that sense, the fact that CPEC has not delivered what China had hoped, has not turned into the model that they had hoped, has been a disappointment in ways that go beyond the bilateral relationship, has been a disappointment when they think about the Belt and Road as a whole, and has been a disappointment when it comes to being able to demonstrate this success model, that it is really advantageous for countries, close friends of China, to enter into this extremely close economic embrace. I think the sense is even Pakistan decided that there were areas and there were costs to this that they didn't want to bear, and there were kind of faults on both sides in terms of the reason that some of these things have proceeded so slowly. And it's not that it's been a complete failure. There's a lot that's moved ahead on the ground, but it hasn't amounted to, I think, what China had hoped it would amount to. And the book certainly looks at the fact that China has not yet built this success model in general to be able to say to countries, well, your future pathway to success is deep integration with our economy. China's pathway to success was deep integration with the advanced Western economies. It was not the China model that it is selling. China's own success model was actually something that relied on Japan, Europe, the US, and others. So the model that it's selling now to countries, which is integrate closely with us, an increasingly state-driven, securitized economic model, is actually not the same thing. And at the moment, these kind of rigidities about how China works, I think, have proved less appealing even to some of China's friends, and I would certainly include Pakistan in that regard.
How would you, and I know I've taken a lot of your time, so if you want to be brief, but how do you see Saudi Arabia and MBS in the Chinese scheme of things when you're talking about these coalitions or alignments? She is reportedly going to be there December 7th to 9th, I think, with an Arab summit on the cards, apparently.
So, I mean, there are these layers to the Chinese relationship. So you have these kind of core coalitions on the two sides, like the closest friends, the closest US treaty allies, and the closest Chinese partners. And there's some oscillation between the status that some of these countries have at different junctures on different issues. These aren't rigid coalitions. These are flexible. They depend on the issues at stake. But you have the kind of close friends and partners. And then the real battle zone for China, as it understands it, is most of the non-aligned world, most of the countries that are not clearly in one camp or the other, or close to being in one camp or the other. And that's going to be, I think, from China's perspective, the framework for how you build in the coming decades a world that looks not just safe for the Chinese Communist Party, but that looks like a world in which Chinese standards, norms, values, and sort of a permissive environment for the Chinese military, all of these sorts of things are created, and lots of that is going to take place across much of the rest of the developing world. Now, the Saudi piece of this is extremely interesting. China, of course, pursues a quite carefully balanced set of relations in the Middle East. It's on good terms with Saudi Arabia, it's on good terms with Iran, it's on good terms with Turkey, notwithstanding some of the issues with the Uyghur question. It's on good terms with Israel, it's on good terms with Egypt as the kind of locus points of the Middle East policy. But what we've seen in terms of the renminbi denomination for oil transactions with China, what we see on the part of, and of course, Saudi Arabia has been a close partner to the United States, but with the US pulling out of the region and some of the tensions with MBS over Khashoggi killing, the balance of what this relationship looks like has evidently moved quite significantly, and has of course moved under the Biden administration versus what we were seeing under Trump. So that's not something that Saudi Arabia is evidently going to give up. But if you're looking from the Chinese perspective at important partners who are able to shore up a kind of alternative framework in the global order, then Saudi Arabia, when it comes to not just the energy transactions, but some of these questions around, if you want to build resilient counter-sanctions coalitions. If you're China sitting looking at what played out with Russia and saying you do not want to go through the same experience yourself, how are you able to build a global financial architecture that is a kind of friendlier one to your interests? Saudi Arabia is an interesting actor in that regard as well. So there's quite a number of pieces to this. I mean, well, this will be an Arab summit, China Arab summit convened around this. I think there's going to be, and we'd already seen, a renewed level of diplomatic energies and attention on China's part directed towards the Middle East in general, with the relative kind of rebalancing away from there from the US. But Saudi Arabia specifically is an important hinge actor for China in the kind of the outer layer of that coalition building, or the kind of essentially creating a framework that is not that, you know, the Saudis move into a sort of the Chinese side on this, but a sort of heightened level of China friendliness, and a kind of pulling back in certain respects on what political ties with the United States look like would be extremely advantageous for China, and something that I think they're really trying to invest in right now.
The big one, of course, is Russia, China. And in your book, again, you quote Xi Jinping, the former editor of Global Times, who said, corralling a few dogs, even a pack, is easier with 2 lions than with 1. But while 2014 Crimea was seen as something to emulate, you say in your book, in China, that is, Ukraine has been a completely different story.
Yes, I mean, we talked to people who were close to kind of PLA discussions on this. They were pretty impressed by some of the Russian military operations, or I mean, in some cases, special forces operations. But the view had been Russia was quite effective at using military power to deliver clear political goals. They certainly saw the Crimea annexation as a success. They saw the Russian presence in Syria as a success, actually, in delivering on Russian political objectives. And they sort of saw this as Russia was willing to take somewhat bolder steps than China was. And there was a debate, you know, should China be thinking in a similar way? Is this something, was China being excessively cowardly even in this regard? Because it also seemed, after the decisions that Russia would take, they were still able to reset their economic relations and political relations with the West afterwards. Yes, there were sanctions after Crimea, but the sanctions were not so biting that Russia wasn't able to operate a sort of relatively well-functioning economy. And so the question was, well, actually, you know, should we perhaps be bolder? And there were all of these kind of debates that would play out around that. And I think when we go back to February, the expectation on China's part, and I certainly cite Chinese experts in the book saying this, was that whatever Russia did would be fast, efficacious, successful in the way that they had seen past operations. And I think that kind of confidence did go up to the top. I think the risk-taking that it represented to give these signals on the eve of war, which is what it represented, to create what was essentially an enabling environment for Putin to take the actions he took in very practical ways. I mean, we saw the decisions to pull troops back from the Chinese borders and the Mongolian borders to the lowest level since the 1920s. There were real kind of material dimensions to what this amounted to. But I think the sense was this was a calculated risk on China's part, because Russia would succeed and relations would normalize again. And that, I think, was the expectation going into it. And they were prepared to take some steps in that statement. They essentially supported the Russian position on NATO, particularly when it came to the 2 treaties that the Russians had proposed, that would essentially have rolled back Allied presence in all new NATO members pretty much since Germany reunified. So what has taken place since then has certainly been a disappointment for China. It has imposed some costs when it comes to the bilateral relationship. There are certain forms of economic ties that have come under more pressure than were there before. And it's been bad for the narrative. It's been bad for a narrative that says that the West is divided, the West is incapable of responding to these things, that the authoritarian powers will inevitably prevail, and that success will come quickly, and it will be possible to go through again with this kind of immediate reset, which of course China will analogize to Taiwan scenarios. And of course, the other piece of it was that China was concerned about the scope of sanctions. I think they had expected the sanctions put in place on Russia to be more modest. I think they'd expected, a sort of Crimea plus maybe, but not what you saw on central banking sanctions, what you saw on the scope of export controls, what you saw on SWIFT payments and things like that for some of the major Russian banks, which, if these were applied to China, would have very significant, arguably even greater effects, given the integration that China has into the economy, and the fact that it's not just a commodity exporter in its most important areas. But there's then a lot of narrative at the moment that says, well, China is regretting things with Russia and is pulling back and things like that. This was a prize for Xi Jinping. It's been pursued as a prize the whole way through his time as party secretary, precisely because Xi Jinping sees a struggle between China and the United States, but really with the West in general, with the liberal democracies. And Russia, for the Chinese alliance strategists, was the number one partner that could really change the balance for China in the world. And still, when you talk to people who are doing military planning for Japan or Taiwan or the US at the moment, there is more of an expectation that Russia could potentially involve itself in contingencies in East Asia than was true at the beginning of the year. These are things that will have a real potential complicating effect on US strategic planning in the region. A close China-Russia relationship on intelligence ties, diplomatic ties, military ties, and the complementary economies that they have. None of this goes away, even with a kind of essentially Russian failure in their military goals in Ukraine and political goals in Ukraine. So there are things that China may not want to see happen when it comes to the threat and use of nuclear weapons. But China is not going to use its influence on Russia in ways that are harmful to this bilateral relationship. It's too important for Xi Jinping. It's too important in the wider analysis of how China sees the global landscape evolving. And you have some hopes from certain pockets that I'm aware of in Europe right now that this is something that China is going to do, because we got the statements from Xi Jinping on nuclear weapons, which have essentially been an absolutely standard part of Chinese policy principles for a long time. And it was evidently useful to have them say it, but it's also clear that in private, they are making no warnings to Russia. There's no threats of consequences, because this isn't how they handle the relationship with Russia. They handle the relationship with Russia extremely carefully. Xi Jinping, as I mentioned the point in the book after Crimea, in which he sends this edict out to Chinese companies, essentially saying, don't treat Russia as if it's operating with its back against the wall. Don't negotiate too hard in ways that make them feel like they're being squeezed, because the political stakes in this are too important. And that's continued to be true and will continue to be true now. And Russia, in a kind of damaged state in different ways coming out of this, is still going to be a more valuable strategic partner for China than almost any other state that you can imagine. And they know that they're not going to win back the United States and realistically Europe either in this regard. And so in the global contest that they see unfolding, Russia is critical to their coalition, and that's not going to move whatever entreaties are made by Western leaders right now.
Jaideep Gadavi, thanks you for a very detailed answer. And my four-legged friend at home is also barking. I think he's warning us. But one quick last one to you, Andrew. So overall, Xi Jinping, many see his aggressiveness as illogical in many senses, taking on so many fronts at the same time. Zero COVID we talked about. Many say that it shouldn't be seen as a population controlling, it should be seen as a population controlling exercise, not a public health one. You point out in your book, doesn't see these as mistakes or ill-judged. So is the world going to continue to see this hard coercive edge?
I mean, we're in a little bit of a testing period on some of this at the moment, because, I mean, this is exactly every time China took one of these actions, the response was, well, they've made a mistake. This is a bad call. Why have they taken the action they did in Galwan? Why have they taken the actions that they did against Australia? Why have they taken the actions that they did on? I mean, you go down a long list of these cases, and each time they would seemingly undercut their own interests. And people would say, well, actually, it's not in China's interests to ABC, whatever these supposed mistakes were. And every single time, the answer was they were not corrected. They were not understood to be mistakes. And at other periods of time in Chinese foreign policy, these were, you could have seen a correction. And I think the understanding that people had going into it was, well, they will see that it's disadvantageous to take everyone on simultaneously. They will see that, and in practice, at every single juncture, that wasn't the case. We're now at this kind of interesting moment where I think China is in a difficult spot right now on multiple different fronts. It's in a weaker position economically than it was. I think there is an understanding on the technology front, particularly the export controls that I mentioned, that its leading industries are not there yet. It's advanced technology industries, it's semiconductor industries, and this is true for certain other sectors as well that depend on them. They're not there yet. This is the question about whether Xi Jinping moved too fast. This is the analogy that I also mentioned in the book about from David Rennie from The Economist, the Bond villain analogy of the point in which all of the sort of nefarious plans are laid out while Bond is trapped, but Bond is able to get away and then thwart the plans. And the question was, why move at this point? Why not actually engineer the conditions first that would mean that it was impossible to escape? Because however you choose to project the time out, there are steps that Xi Jinping could have taken, there are steps that the Communist Party leadership could have taken that would have diffused so many of the different issues and would still have positioned China for in strategically advantageous terms, politically, militarily, economically, its access to technologies. And the gap is still there. The gap is there on the financial sector and its exposure to the US dollar system, and the gap is still there when it comes to advanced technologies, and they're not going to be able to close it quickly. So on this, I think there is an even more acute understanding. I talked to one interlocutor on the Chinese side about the export controls, who said, well, when the Trump administration pushed these sorts of measures through, they always left lots of exemptions and get-arounds and things. And in this case, we have seen something much, much tighter. And I think there is an understanding that actually, when it comes to some of these choke point technologies, the US government is going to go harder on these, and this is going to have real effects. So of course, the political dimensions domestically, Xi Jinping looks less strong even a few weeks beyond party congress as a result of what's playing out with zero COVID than he did in this supposedly fully consolidated position that he had. But there is a question, therefore, on what represent mistakes. How far is there a view that just says everything must be doubled down on, which has been Xi Jinping's approach the whole way? Or does he see some areas that are at least tractable to very, very modest readjustments that will yield disproportionate rewards? And I think we've all been waiting for the point in which there are at least these modest tactical readjustments to say, well, it's cheap to improve relations with various of these countries. You have to give almost nothing, but people are so desperate for a rebalancing of tensions that they will be willing to warm ties up as a result of really not very much being given on the Chinese side. And this is a testing process that was playing out at the G20, for instance. And some countries went into those meetings and came out of those meetings saying, we're not giving anything yet. You have not changed any of the fundamentals of your approach. You've had a meeting, you've made some vaguely more helpful statements on a few things, but there's no substantive change. And I think that will be the same for a number of countries. But I think there is a bit of an effort underway to see if minor revisions to policy will at least be able to fix or upgrade relations with a few countries where they had deteriorated very markedly. And we see domestically, at least with zero COVID, that there will be some very modest initial changes to policies that were creating considerable tension. Now, I mean, the analysis that some have still is, when it comes to the actual underlying politics of this, they will see the vulnerabilities that this represented. The idea that people can come out on the streets and demand that Xi Jinping resigns, this was not supposed to be the sort of thing that could still happen. And the view is going to be this: if this is still possible, then in other areas, we need to go even harder on ideological control, societal control. How do we make sure that this can't happen? And yes, we may make some moves on zero COVID, but when it comes to the deeper questions that are at stake, the approach has at every single turn been securitize, move in a more ideological direction, double down. And I think the expectation is still, this is Xi Jinping's approach. The direction is pretty set, and there isn't much wiggle room on this. So my expectation is his calculation on most of these areas will continue to be, these are not mistakes. This is the strategic environment China is in. This is just a reflection of reality. Countries will respect power and coercion rather than in the end we'll respect that rather than alternatives, and I think we're going to be stuck dealing with this. But I think at the margins we're in a little window right now in which there's a little bit of a testing out to see how do countries respond. We've had 3 years, close to 3 years of not having these meetings, and now you're back to some level of bilateral diplomacy again. And so how countries respond, and when I do the debriefs from everyone, country by country, on what the exchanges with Xi Jinping were in Bali or in these other visits and things at the moment, there are quite different responses to how people are thinking about this. I think this is a difficult economic set of conditions for the world right now. The Europeans are dealing with a lot of extremely problematic situation for energy, the economic picture, the security picture with Russia. They're desperate right now, frankly, for something that they can point to as good news. And this has certainly played into the dynamics with which certain leaders are handling the China relationship at the moment. But I think on the fundamentals of China's direction under Xi Jinping, it was very clear from Party Congress, the clean sweep of all of his people. This is not going to change, and we have to think about policy on the assumption that whatever we see on the margins, the fundamentals are headed in the same direction that they've been headed the whole time Xi Jinping has been in power.
Andrew Small, you've lived up to the American title of your book, No Limits, at least in terms of the time you've given us on to discuss the book and various events that are taking place and are still moving forward. Thank you so much. All the best for your book, and for those of you in India, I do believe you can still get it online, though. Andrew, I think you'll have a dedicated release in India sometime next year, right?
Yeah, I will do sort of an official launch in India at some point in the new year. I think there'll be books available in a more dedicated way from in January, but of course there are editions that are definitely available from my publishers even now. So hopefully people can get their hands on them already.
They can, because when I checked online, yeah, you can get the book even now. Thanks again, Andrew, and hope to see you on your India trip as well.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for doing this. Delighted to join you, and really enjoyed the questions and discussion.
Completely our pleasure. As we said, you can, of course, follow our Telegram channel to get the latest updates when we put them up on our website, or videos like this on our YouTube channel. You can also help support us. There is a QR code that has been flashing on your screen. It's up there now, or else there is a link in the YouTube descriptor. This is the Talking Point on StratNews Global, a rather long talking point, but extremely fruitful. I'm Amitabh Revi.